We can talk extensively about COVID-19 and the number of studies over and over and over again, which have showed, not just in COVID-19, but over and over again, that vitamin D in people seem to predict their outcome. High vitamin D levels, those type of patients seem to do better. They didn't get SARS-CoV-2 as often. If they did get it, they didn't seem to be as sick. If they went to the hospital, they seem to have a better survival, as opposed to people who had low vitamin D levels. And so what we tried to do was we tried to give high doses of vitamin D to individuals. And sure enough, there has been some studies which have indicated that might have been helpful with some endpoints. Again, it was given acutely and takes time for vitamin D to be metabolized to its active form. And so it may not have been given. There was a meta-analysis that was done back in 2018 that was published in the British Medical Journal. Dr. Martineau et al. Showed in a meta-analysis of over 25 randomized placebo-controlled trials that supplementation on a regular basis with vitamin D improved outcomes in acute chest infections. There's been a longitudinal study in Ireland, which showed that it reduced chest infections by 50%. So clearly there's some evidence there, but we're not seeing the robust type of endpoints that we would like to see, at least with COVID-19. And I think there may be an explanation for that. What we're seeing, really interesting, is that sunlight itself may actually have within it some properties other than the ultraviolet B radiation producing vitamin D. Let me give you an explanation as to why I say that. In Europe, they did a study looking at when was the first day of the surge during the winter of 2020. And what they looked at, it was a number of different variables. They looked at humidity.
And this was the COVID-19 surge, I suppose.
Yes, this is the COVID-19 surge in 2020. And they looked at humidity. It did not correlate with humidity. They looked at temperature. It did not correlate with temperature. What it did correlate with was latitude. In other words, the countries that were more northern had their first surge earlier in the season. And this is probably related to the lack of sunlight that happened earlier in those northern latitude countries. There was another study that was published out of the University of Edinburgh, which looked at the United States during that same time period. And they looked at the northern portion of the United States to see whether or not there was a distinctive difference in latitude there. They picked the northern part of the United States because they wanted to make sure that there was very little ultraviolet B radiation making vitamin D. And they were able to show that even in this area where vitamin D was insignificant, there was a definite correlation between high latitudes and high mortality. In other words, more sunlight was better. So then they took that and they a priori went to England, repeated the study there, same results, and went to Italy and repeated the results there in Italy, same result. And so what you're seeing here is that as you're exposed to more and more sunlight, and we believe that it's infrared radiation that's doing most of the heavy lifting there, and I'll explain to you why, the more sunlight, the better the outcomes in terms of COVID-19. So this brings me to a really amazing discovery that has now just sort of become more mainstream here in the last maybe 5 years or so. And that has to do with the mitochondria. And this is really exciting information. The mitochondria is that part of the cell that produces energy. And just like an engine in a car, the mitochondria produces ATP, which is what the cell needs. But as a byproduct of that, it also produces hydroxy radicals. These are oxygen reactive species, oxidative stress. It's like an engine. An engine is supposed to produce locomotion, but the byproduct of that is it creates heat. And if that heat is not dealt with, that can shut down the engine. It's the same thing with the mitochondria. These reactive oxygen species, if not dealt with, can cause a lot of damage to the mitochondria. And that damage has been connected with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, even dementia, and learning disabilities. And these are very common conditions here in the United States, and they've become more common in the last 50 years as opposed to 100 or 150 years ago. So what is it that's going on? I can tell you the main cooling system of the mitochondria we're discovering is melatonin. And melatonin is even more powerful than glutathione in terms of an antioxidant. It seems as though the mitochondria cooling system has two cooling systems, actually. There's a cooling system at night, and there's a cooling system during the day. When I say cooling system, an antioxidant system, something that takes away the oxidative stress that's going on in the mitochondria that could damage it and shut it down. At nighttime, the pineal gland in the brain secretes melatonin, which is secreted into the bloodstream. The mitochondria collect this, actively bringing it into the mitochondria, and it's able to quell the reactive oxygen species there and make sure that the mitochondria run smoothly at night. I say that only if there's not a lot of bright light being exposed or any kind of light being exposed to the eyes at night. Because if there is, that will shut down melatonin production. And unfortunately, you're going to run your engines hot. So what have we done in the United States and in the developed world in the last 50 years? We've turned on lights, we have iPads, we have iPhones, we have televisions, we have YouTube, we have all of these things that we expose our eyes to. We go to bed late, melatonin production is very low. And as a result of that, we're running our engines hot. Now, let's switch to the daytime, or what is the cooling system for the day? As it turns out, very interestingly, near infrared radiation from the sun, that's the kind of radiation that we feel when we have our back to the sun, and we can feel those sun's rays penetrating our clothes, penetrating our skin, going deep down into the tissue and activating our heat receptors. Near infrared radiation is very good at penetrating and getting deep down. You don't have to be directly exposed to it. It can penetrate. That type of radiation, that type of sunlight stimulates in the mitochondria, right where it's needed, the production of melatonin right there in the matrix of the mitochondria. And what's happened to us in the developed world in the last 100 years? We spend 7% of our time outside, 93% of the time we're inside. We're in our cars. We don't go into the sun. We don't work outside. We don't do any of these things. We've become very well-to-do. We've become rich, and we have these nice buildings that we stay in. And unfortunately, they are basically causing us, I believe, disease and problems that we don't see in the undeveloped world. We're the ones that are suffering the most from COVID-19 here in the United States. We have 4% of the population, but we have 25% of the cases.
For the longest time, and I haven't checked numbers lately, but it seemed like in Africa, for example, in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, we haven't seen ginormous waves of COVID. And so what you're saying is one very possible reason for that could be this very fact that they, by the nature of how they live their lives, they spend a lot of time in the outdoors, and they benefit from this warming effect of the sun, which is not just warming you and make you feel nice, but what you are saying is we are finding that it actually causes in the daytime the production of melatonin inside the mitochondria. Did I get that right?
That's correct. Yeah, they've done very, very elegant studies on this. The melatonin is created from serotonin. They actually radio-labeled the carbons, the hydrogens, with deuterium, which is an isotope of hydrogen. And they were able to show very elegantly that these hydrogens in the serotonin became incorporated in the melatonin. They were able to isolate intramitochondrially, showing very clearly that when near-infrared radiation hits cytochrome C oxidase, which is part of the electron transport chain, for those who understand what that is, that signals the increase in metabolism, and it causes an increase in melatonin production.
And that's a very interesting concept to think about, that a part of the very machine that breaks food down and makes energy, at the same time producing the cooling agent to prevent it from overheating.
That's exactly right.
It's an amazing device, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, and if you go on to, like, for instance, the Cleveland Clinic's website, they will talk to you and show you very clearly that mitochondrial dysfunction is very closely tied to a lot of the diseases that we see in the United States: diabetes, learning disabilities, dementia. The list goes on. Let's not forget, let's not forget that the ACE2 receptor is not just a receptor. When the virus binds ACE2, it shuts down its enzymatic activity. And its enzymatic activity is intimately tied to keeping the reduction oxidation balance in the cell. So you can imagine if you're staying up late at night, if you're not going to sleep at the appropriate time, if you're letting things hit your eyes, your retina. In the daytime, you're not getting an adequate amount of sunshine. You're essentially running your engine hot all the time. And imagine what happens now when you hit COVID-19 hill. You're having this engine that's running very hot, and you're going up a very long hill. You know what's going to happen. You see this all the time. There's going to be steam coming out of the radiator, and the car is going to be off to the side of the road. You're not going to be able to weather that storm very well if you're running your engine hot.
Here in Washington State, where I live, and in Romania, where part of my audience will be, we are at the 45th parallel on the latitude. When I test vitamin D levels in some of my patients, almost 90% of people who don't take supplementation are deficient.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that's a marker of insufficient exposure to sunshine and to the outdoors. What would be a reasonable thing for the average person to do to optimize this aspect?
So number one, I'm a firm believer in vitamin D supplementation. Look, it's available. You can take it. Here's the thing that you've got to understand about sunlight is that the vitamin D production comes mainly from ultraviolet B radiation. That type of sun exposure only happens when the sun is pretty high up in the sky, because ultraviolet B can't penetrate very well through the atmosphere. So between the hours of 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, that's when you're getting the most amount of ultraviolet B radiation, which is good for the production of vitamin D. Unfortunately, ultraviolet radiation is also very good at producing other bad things in your skin, like damage and things of that nature, maybe even skin cancers, although that's debatable in some of the information. But here's the good news. The good news is that the type of radiation that I'm talking about with the mitochondria is infrared radiation. Infrared radiation can penetrate things very easily. When the sun is just starting to come up, or even in the wintertime in Romania, when the sun is only coming up so much, even at that level, if you're out there, the sun is going to be putting off infrared radiation, and you're going to be able to absorb that, even though you're wearing clothes, because it can penetrate through that and go pretty deep. So remember that, number one. It doesn't have to be very high. You can see it at sunrise. You can see it at sunset. You're getting that heat. Just to think about this, when there's snow on the ground and the sun comes up, even in the wintertime, the sun can melt the snow.
Right.
The energy that the sun is melting the snow with is infrared radiation. So just be aware that it's coming. It's there. It's in the wintertime. You've got to go meet it. The other thing I'd mention to you as well is you don't have to be directly in the sun to get the benefit of infrared radiation. I'll give you an example. If you are outside and you're in the shade, and there's a lot of green trees and green plants, there's something about chlorophyll, there's something about those green trees and plants that reflect infrared radiation extremely well. If you look at any infrared photography, just go to Google and type in infrared photography and go to images and see what pops up. You'll see that the leaves, the trees, the grass is almost like they're white with snow in the pictures. And it's because that they are particularly very good at reflecting infrared radiation. I found this fascinating to me because we have a number of studies for a number of decades that go back that show over and over and over again that people that live in green spaces, people that live up around greenery, seem to have better health. They have better learning capacity. They have less anxiety, and it just seems to be better for them. This is potentially a mechanism as to why that may be the case. We also know that these trees and plants give off phytocides or aromatic compounds that directly interact with the immune system and enhance the immune system's ability to fight off infections too. So it's like a package deal. If you're outside, you're going to get sunlight. You're probably going to get some vitamin D. You're going to be getting infrared radiation if you're around green plants. And the green plants are going to reduce your cortisol level, which is good. And also, you're going to be getting these aromatic compounds that are going to be helping out. It's almost as if the outside natural environment was specifically designed to enhance the experience.